Okay, there are two things we want to do in this program. One is we want to have two different states that we can switch back and forth between. We did that in an earlier video using a timer. When the timer counted down to 0, we would switch from the red state to the green state, reset the timer. When it got back down to 0, we'd go from the green state to the red state. And every time the timer got down to 0, we would flip state. So we had a two-state program, and we used a timer to determine what state we were in. We're going to do the same thing here, but we're not going to use a timer. This time what we're going to do is we are going to look for a button to be pressed on the game controller. When the button is pressed, we will change from the red state to the green state. When it's pressed a second time, we'll go from green to red. We'll keep toggling back and forth between those two states every time we press a specific button on the game controller. So we need a few variables up here at the top. We need to keep track of what the state of the gamepad is. So we've got a type called gamepad state, and we need a variable of that type, and I'm just going to call it pad1. We also need to keep track of what game state we're in. We're just going to use an integer for that. And we need some values for the game state. We're going to use constants for that. So we'll do a constant int red equals 1, green equals 2. And I don't need the int in there twice. And since what we're doing to figure out what state we're in, or to display what state we're in, we're changing the background color. We need a color variable, and we'll call it back color. Okay. At the beginning, let's go down here to initialize. When we start, we need to specify what state we're going to be in, and the game state we're going to be in is going to be red. When we're in the red state, our back color is going to be red. Okay. And now let's, before we start writing any logic, let's go down here and first of all, I'm going to get rid of this if statement. That's the default one. We're going to write our own way to get out of here. And we're going to set back color equal to back color. Okay. So if I run this program now, it should go to the red state and it should stay there forever. So let's go ahead and start it. And there's the red state, and it's going to stay that way for a very, very long time. Okay? So we'll close the program. I said we were going to replace that if state. We're not going to replace it. We're just going to click on the X up there to end our program. So we're getting in the red state, and now what we need to do is we need to write some code. And the code for updating our program is always going to be in the update method down here. So what do we want to do to change states? We're going to change states whenever we press a particular button on the gamepad, the game controller. So we need to read the game controller. So the variable is pad1, and we tell it to go out to the gamepad object and get state. And when we tell it we want to get state, you can have multiple controllers. So we need to specify which controller we want, and they're numbered from 1 to 4. And the first one that's connected is obviously going to be index number 1. So this says go out and read gamepad number 1. Then we want to check to see if a particular button has been pressed. So that's obviously going to be an if statement. Then we need to check the state of pad 1. And we need to figure out which button it is. And you know, if you look at these things here, we've got things we can check. We can look at the buttons. We can look at the D-pad. We can look, so I'm looking at these wrenches here. We can look at the triggers. We can look at the thumbsticks. The other two we're not going to worry about here. But we're going to go on the start button. So, whoops, so I need to say buttons, dot, and then start should be an option here if I press the letter S. So if buttons.start equals button state dot, there's only two choices here. It's either pressed or it's a release. So if it's pressed, that's an indication I want to change states. Okay, so now what I have to do is I have to figure out what state I'm in and then switch to the other state. So if I'm currently in the red state, then I want to switch to the green state. So game state is green, and I also need to set the back color at the same time. And I was going to do a line for that, wasn't I? Else, if the game state is equal to green, then what I want to do is switch back to red. So my game state equals red, and my back color equals red. Okay? Okay, so let's run that program and see what happens. And it's not going to do exactly what we want it to do yet. It's close. So now I'm going to press the start button right now. And it looks like I went to the green state maybe several times, but I ended up back in the red state. I'm going to press it again right now. Okay, that time I got to green, but you see all that flickering going on? I'm going to press it again right now. That one looked pretty good. I'm going to press it again. This time I'm going to hold it down a little bit. Ready, set, press. And I got some weird stuff going on here. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop the program. And our problem is due to the fact that in update gets executed 60 times a second. Okay, so on the first tick, if I have pressed the start button, its state will be pressed, and if I'm in the red state, I'll change to green, and then I'll go back. And on the next tick of the clock, if I haven't let go of the button yet, and it's very difficult to hold the button down for only 1/60th of a second, it's still going to be pressed. And so I'm going to flip-flop states. So if I hold it down for 3 ticks of the clock, on the first tick, it'll go from red to green, then it'll go from green to red, then it'll go from red to green, and then on the, is that 3 ticks yet? And it'll just keep going back and forth for every tick. Okay, so if I hold it down for an odd number of ticks, it will switch states. If I hold it down for an even number of ticks, it will stay in the same state at the end. But in between, it'll be constantly flipping back and forth at the rate of 60 times a second. So it's not enough just to check to see if the button is pressed or not. Sometimes that's all you need to check. But in this case, what we need to know is, did it just get pressed on this tick of the clock? And we'll know if it got pressed on this tick of the clock because it was released on the last tick, and on this tick, it is now pressed. And it's only on that change when it goes from released to pressed that I want to make a note of it and change states. So I have a picture over here in a Word document that kind of shows what we're looking for here. So let me scroll down a little bit. And so right here. So this row up here represents 42 ticks of the clock. And this row down here represents the state of my start button, where R is released and P is pressed. So if it's released, nothing happens on the first 9 ticks. And then on tick number 10, I press it. Well, I hold it down for, it looks like, about 8 ticks of the clock here. And so on each one of these ticks of the clock, it's going to see that it's pressed, and it's going to flip-flop the state, flip-flop, flip-flop, and it's going to flip-flop the state 8 times. I'll end up right back where I started. And then I'm released, and I'll stay there for a while, and then I press it again, and it starts flip-flopping back and forth. And it looks like I did 8 of them. No, I did 9 of them here. So on this one, it will actually go to green. But what we're concerned about is right here is where I want to change the state. And then again, right here is where I want to change the state. And so what I'm doing down here is I'm showing the previous tick above, and the previous value above, and then the current value down here. So if you look at this, what I want to do is I want to, basically I took this and copied it and just slid it over one. So here's the previous state, here's the current state down here. So when it goes from from released to pressed, that's when I want to change states. And then I don't do anything else until it goes from released to pressed again later on. Now the only way I can know that this change occurred is if I keep track of the previous state of the gamepad. So this row up here will tell me what the previous state was. This row down here tells me what the current state is. So I need another variable. I need a variable that will keep track of what the previous state was. And if I flip back over here, let's go back up to the top. I'm going to need two gamepad variables, one called pad1 and one called previous pad1. And we will use that to hold the state on the previous tick of the clock. So how do you know what the state was on the previous tick of the clock? Well, at the beginning of this tick, I start doing this. When I get all done, I'm at the end of the current tick of the clock. The last thing I do before going on is I save previous pad 1 gets a copy of what's in pad 1 right now. Okay? So let's say I'm on tick number 1. I read what's in pad 1 on tick number 1. Down here, I save what's in pad 1 on tick number 1 in here. So previous pad 1 has what was in tick number 1. Then I go to tick number 2. And the first thing I do in the beginning of tick number 2 is I read a new value into pad 1, which is the current state on tick number 2. And if I want to see what the previous state was on tick number 1, here it is. It's in previous pad 1. Okay? So it's not enough to see if it's pressed on the current tick of the clock. What also matters is that it has to have been released on the previous tick of the clock. So previous pad1 dot buttons dot start equals button state dot released. Okay, and that's all we have to do. So declare a new variable, check the state on the previous tick of the clock, and then remember to save it at the bottom. It's easy to forget this bottom one here. So that's pretty straightforward. We only had to do 3 lines of code. Now let's go ahead and run it. Okay, nothing happened. Before, when I pressed the button, we got all this flickering. I'm going to press the button right now, and it switches. No flickering. Now I'm going to press it again right now, and no flickering. And we have fixed the problem. I'm going to press it again, and again, and again, and you see no flickering. Every time I press the button, it switches states. So there are a lot of times when all you need to do is check to see if the button is pressed or not. But there are other times when you just want to know if it was pressed right now, and this is the first time that it was pressed. Okay, so if you just need to check to see if it's pressed, you don't even need this stuff over here. But if you want to know if this is the first time that it was pressed, then you need to have that extra check in there.